Well, I'm talking to you today from Wisconsin, in part because I came here in mid-March, March 18th specifically, to help my parents. My mom had surgery for very early stage colon cancer. I'm happy to say she's fine. Everything went well. But in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I suddenly realized all my flights back would be canceled, and they were. So I am sheltering in place with my parents in their house, and I'm talking to you from their living room, which is very exciting to me. My own background is arts and humanities. I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota in the Comparative Studies in Discourse and Society program. And the work I do in death studies as a field, broadly defined, is around bioethics, history of science and technology studies, the dead body. And also, I've done work in pandemic response planning and pandemic and epidemic response, institutional responses, which may come up today, I have a feeling. But the Center for Death and Society itself, of which I'm director, is an interdisciplinary study center on all topics related to death, dying, and the dead body.
Great. And thanks again for joining us today, John. Did you mention how your upbringing might have brought you into the field you are in today?
Sure. So my upbringing, so my background is definitely part of the research I do, although it was never part of it. And my background is actually expanded in this way. So historically, and I think the thing that maybe two people don't know about me at this point is that I grew up in the American funeral industry. My father was a funeral director for many decades, 35 years in the States. So I grew up around funerals, and I read about this in the book. That experience of growing up in the funeral industry was very important, I think, in how I came to understand the work I do. But also, on a more personal note, I've had recent experiences with both death, but also end of life situations. The preface to my book opens with me writing about the death of my younger sister Julie, who died in 2018, July 29th of 2018, from brain cancer in Italy, where she was living. And the whole experience of her death and how I talk about her death became a very important moment, I think, for me to understand my own work, but also what just death and dying means. Like, what does it mean? How do we experience it? But then also in December and then January, my father had a massive cardiac arrest at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, returning from a cruise, as my parents do, returning from a cruise with my mom, and died. He died at the airport, but was resuscitated. Thankfully by just a, I don't know, like a whole platoon of people showed up at the airport, and spent 3 weeks in a hospital, 2 weeks in an ICU, on a ventilator, which we hear about much today, another week in hospitalization, and then another month in rehab, in a transitional care facility that's part of a nursing home, which we're hearing a lot about today. He's now home, he's fine. And I mention all this because there's a postscript in the book, in the preface, after I talk about my sister's dying, where I talk about what had happened to my father, because it was right at the beginning of all that. And so if anyone's read the book, and I would of course encourage you to read the book, but at the end of it, it's ambiguous as to what happens, but I will say he's alive. He made it home miraculously in ways we don't fully understand. My parents are both here, and indeed you may see them wander through the frame
Yeah,
at some point.
I was
But
about to say.
we'll see. But nonetheless, so I historical background, I grew up in the film industry, but more recently, I have absolutely gone through experiences of loss, the death of my sister, but then also to this really, and harrowing is the best way I can describe it. I'm laughing only because it worked out, but it was difficult to explain in the moment what was going on. And that has absolutely had an impact on how I think about my work, and especially has given me a lot of time to reflect on what is happening right now with families who are experiencing deaths connected with COVID-19. Either they have a family member dying as a result of the coronavirus, or they have a family member who is dying not from the coronavirus, but that death is being impacted by the pandemic itself. And I'm happy to talk about that later, although that's sort of an add-on if people have questions about that as well.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered so much just in your personal introduction, but there's so much more to talk about. So can you give us a short summary of what the book is about before we really
Sure,
hop into it?
sure. So at the dawn of time, when humans were, I'm kidding, I'll stop. I won't start at the dawn of time, but that was actually as a joke for any of my students who are watching, because I tell them never to do that in their essays. So the book itself, Technologies of the Human Corpse, which is helpfully displayed behind me, is it's a book that started out actually out in grad school, and it started as a question I just asked myself, which was, so what is human technology's relationship with the dead body? Like, what is it? Now, I think we in our own contemporary moment tend to think of technology as being a very digital, computer-based experience. Indeed, I do this experiment with my undergraduates or students who are visiting the University of Bath, and I'll say, show me technology, and the first thing they're all trying to do is hold their phone up. And you'll have a few students who'll say, well, no, I've got a watch or I've got a pencil. I always use my glasses. Glasses have been one of the great human technologies that certainly made my professional life possible. But I became interested in this broad question of technology. So the book itself starts with the 19th century, and what we look at is how the 19th century, I think, creates, I argue, a kind of template for understanding how the dead body can be altered and changed. So the examples I use are embalming, but also photography, things like communication tools like the telegraph line, but also the railway system. Transport became a way to move the dead body back and forth in the same way we see it today with air transport. But then in the broader question of technology, I became curious, like, so how do these technologies become things that are used in a outside the material sense? What happens to a politics of death and dying once we can communicate it in new ways? And so I think that in the 1970s, we see this emergence of movements of death as social movements. So death acceptance movements, death awareness movements. The right to die movement really takes shape in the 1970s. And you have all these movements that are trying to use these new forms of communication around death and dying, that then I think really, really begin to take shape and really find their own, but for the most tragic of reasons, when we can begin to shift to look at, what's the impact of something like the AIDS epidemic. And so the third chapter of the book, and I'll talk more about AIDS when we get into the book itself, but I'm really curious. I was really curious, like, what was the impact of the AIDS epidemic on the dead body? Like, how can we conceptualize of something like an AIDS corpse? And I think that through different kinds of technological advances, but also breakdowns, it became clear that something like a disease like AIDS, or a viral disease, not at all dissimilar in some ways to COVID-19, has an impact on how we perceive human technologies, both successes and failures, when it comes to dead bodies. And then I became interested in other kinds of forms, so presentation, representational practices, museum displays, things like Body Worlds and Gunther von Hagens, also the use of technology in transforming biomaterials into new kinds of biological medical products. So the idea of a trafficking of, or a buying and selling, or a transactional economy around dead body parts, not organs, so we're setting organs outside of this, but more biological materials like skin, tissues, bones, eyes, corneas, fingernails, teeth. There's a market for all of it. But then also a broader economy, a broader politics, like what are the politics of death and dying in our current era? So like, what is the future of death? How do we have both human fantasies and utopic visions, but also then, consistent and I think actually completely expected disappointments in the failure of technology to give us eternal life, which I'll put right now, I don't think is possible, nor do I think is desirable. But nonetheless, this sort of great hope that somehow technology will save humans from themselves. In that way, the technology always becomes the answer and the menace. And so in large part, what I think the book was trying to do is resist and sort of critique the technological determinist argument, which always wants to blame the technology for this or that, or say the technology is doing it. The technology is not doing anything. It's how we humans are using our tools. And that for me becomes one of, I think, the crucial takeaways from the book itself.
Great. So you've already mentioned this a little bit, but what is the primary inspiration for your book?
Well, I mean, the book in part was the book was inspired. It was a very specific moment actually in grad school. And it was a very specific moment a pre-World War II, early 20th century course on cinema and spectacle, taught by Heidi Wasson, who at the time was at the University of Minnesota, is now up in Canada. And what we were looking at, the argument in the class was that cinema should not come as a surprise because we humans already knew how to be audiences, whether it was through earlier forms of theater and opera, whatever that might be, but actually more specifically through 19th century spectacle. And in the late 19th century, the 1890s, in Paris, unidentified bodies of men and women, and sometimes children, would be put on display. And the idea was the Parisians would stroll by, and there were special displays put up, sort of a special platform put up, and the bodies were behind glass. And the idea was people would identify the dead bodies. And that was the reason for it. Well, no one really ever named the bodies, but thousands of Parisians came to see the dead. And this was an article that Vanessa Schwartz wrote in an anthology. And so I read this in grad school, and I was like, I know dead bodies. In America at that time, I know dead bodies were being embalmed and they were being preserved as a result of the U.S. Civil War, which if anyone Wikipedia's embalming, you'll inevitably come across the U.S. Civil War angle. And you can tell reporters all Google the same or Wikipedia the same point on this, because every single reporter ever writes about embalming has to write about the U.S. Civil War, which is true, but you can see where they're copying and pasting from the same material. Nonetheless, one of the bodies, a couple of the bodies, particularly the body of a young child, began to show the effects of decomposition, which you would expect. I knew embalming was taking place. So I was curious, why that might be happening. Called my dad, as I would do in this situation. It's like, Dad, I'm curious about embalming. When was it happening in America? What was going on? And he said, well, let me give you some of my old textbooks. So he gave me some of his old textbooks that he taught from when he also taught in mortuary science, taught funeral directors. And there was one book in particular that had a photo that I'll show everyone in a little bit of the Bisga Man. And the Bisga Man was an advertisement for embalming fluid that then forever changed my life. So I suddenly realized I had a project around the dead body and technology and preservation and a whole long list of things. And 1,000 Dreams then launched. I don't know how else to explain it. It would be like, in some ways it's a crazy story, but I should also point out for those, if there are any sort of grad students watching, stick with it. I'll just tell you right now, just stick with it. It's crazy. It's insane. Or early career academics, there's 1,000 reasons to just be like, what the hell am I doing? But, the Center for Death and Society, where I'm now director, didn't exist when I was in grad school. It didn't exist. And in fact, I got asked point blank how I was going to turn my project into a job, which was a legit question by some of my committee members. They're like, how is this going to be a job? And I was like, I don't know. I'll find it. I had no idea. But, and I did. So I'm very lucky that way. But I'm just saying, there are ways that these things work out. And if you see something that you think is really interesting, in my case, it was the dead body and technology, just chase after it. Go for it, because there are ways to make it work you can't even expect. All right, I'm sorry, that was enough of my inspirational talk.
That was okay. You did a great job of making death studies inspirational.
Well, it is, and there's a lot of people in it. I presumably I would hope, have many colleagues from death studies watching this today. No, it's all right, guys. But in fact, we were talking before, as I didn't realize it was a field. I'm embarrassed to say this. I did not know death studies was a field until I actually was pretty much done with my PhD. And I was like, there's just a whole world. Because my own back, it's not a field you find as much in America. And my own background, as I explained it, was bioethics, science and technology studies, arts and humanities. And it just wasn't something I had thought about. And but it is, and I think we can transform these things into all kinds of fields.
And it sounds like a very multidisciplinary.
It is, yeah, I think so. There is, and before any of my American colleagues who are members of the different groups in America, I think there is a strong world of studying death and dying in America, and I want to be very clear about that. It has always been based around psychology and psychiatry to a certain extent, but also death education. And so those are very strong fields, and they have very strong American foundations. In the UK and across Europe, it does tend to be more sociology, but also then arts and humanities. And you will find the groups absolutely, mixing together. But there have been longstanding epistemological, perhaps is the best way to say it, tensions at times between the psychology side and the sociology side. And this is a history within the field of deaf studies that I entered into, but certainly as a person in philosophy, arts and humanities, bioethics, science and technology studies. And so we're over here. One of the easiest ways to think about this without getting, if you're not in academia at all, which is also fine, there's three groups. There's the deaf group, there's the dying group, and then there's the dead body group. And these three groups will connect, but they don't necessarily want anything to do with each other. So you've got the people who look at death, the people who look at dying, and then the people who look at the dead body. And I have always historically been in more the dead body side, and that's really where the book is located in a lot of ways. However, all of us will end up working in the different areas. But there is absolutely no reason you should expect that anyone who works on death is interested in dying or the dead body. And I will tell you right now that those of us who work in the dead body world, the dead body side, we're often sometimes like the poor cousin who no one wants to talk to. Like as soon as it's the dead body, I've got colleagues who are like, we're done. Like we're not interested in this anymore. So there've been like historical differences in how the material is approached. I've always started at the dead body. So I've started with the dead body, worked towards dying, and then worked towards death. Or don't think of it as a linear process. It's very three-dimensional, but I've always thought of wanting to start with the dead body as opposed to leaving it as an afterthought. And that I think is in a lot of ways what's happened over the years.
Yeah, I can see how some people might be hesitant to get into that field, but someone has to do that research.
Well, yes and no. I mean, people have been studying death in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons, but I think that there are. I mean, I think for a lot of people, they'd be like, how do I get a job with this? Which I get. That's a material concern. I'm not dismissing that. But I think there are ways to study it, and new ways. We're always finding new ways to study this topic. I mean, we're in the middle of a new way right now, in the middle of a pandemic, and that always offers new ways to think about things like end of life, human mortality, death and dying, dead bodies.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a little bit more about your book. I know
Great.
that a lot of your book focuses around the history of these technologies. Much of the book focuses on the history. So can you start kind of at the beginning of the history that you include in the book?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the book you're talking about, Hannah, is Technologies of the Human Corpse. I just, in case you can't see it behind me, but the book itself, it starts in the 19th century, and now we're going to do a little audio visual jiggery-do here. So we're going to share a screen here. We'll see how this goes. This could become very exciting very quickly, everyone. So here we go. And should be there, and right. So now everyone should see the Bisgaman slide, and the Bisgaman, as I said, was the inspiration for my PhD, and this actually I think represents a perfect kind of 19th into the 20th century moment around the dead body. So the beginning of the book actually starts with questions around how 19th century preservation technologies impacted the dead body. And the classic example that will always get used that starts in the American world around what we would think of as funeral directing, but also just preservation is embalming. So in the mid-19th century, as a result, but not totally as a result of the American Civil War, it became necessary to preserve dead bodies, or there was a request put in to preserve dead bodies for shipment home on trains. So you had a railway system that was making travel more possible, but it also meant you needed the bodies preserved to ship them back home. Now, the US Civil War coincides with this technological development of body preservation, what we would call mechanical, chemical embalming, but it also coincides then with the assassination, tragically, of Abraham Lincoln. And so Lincoln becomes the first American president embalmed, in part because Thomas Holmes, who was doing some of the early embalming work, embalmed some of the first Civil War dead in the North. And Mary Lincoln was so taken with how alive and good, if you will, the Northern war dead looked. She asked when Lincoln was embalmed that he was assassinated, he'd be embalmed. And so his body was sent across America in a special train that Americans could stand at the side of the rails and show their respect to. But it also becomes a big moment in the head of the nation himself being embalmed and preserved. So what embalming created was this whole new technique of changing what the dead body looked like in death, where suddenly you had a lot more time and you had an ability to, if you will, return the dead body to a more alive looking state. And this is all documented in different writings that early embalmers were doing. So the biscuit man becomes a crucial moment in this. And so the biscuit fluid ad that you're looking at right here, the biscuit man was created by an American embalmer named Carl Lewis Barnes. And Carl Lewis Barnes is really sort of the great showman of American embalming and funeral practice. And what Barnes did was he created a series of adverts showing the supremacy of his embalming fluid, so biscuit fluid. But he did more than that. He created a series of trade show, if you will, presentation pieces. So this is a photograph of the biscuit man. And the photograph is of this gentleman sitting in the chair holding an advertisement for biscuit embalming fluid. But what you can't see underneath is a small caption that says, photograph taken 3 months after death. And so what Carl Lewis Barnes did was he embalmed the biscuit man and would take him around to different funeral trade shows, set him up in this chair next to his stand, as we would think of it today, to just demonstrate the supremacy of what he was able to accomplish with his embalming fluid. But what struck me about this ad from Barnes, and this for me became real crucial moments for this idea of technology, was it's a photograph of an embalmed dead body looking alive. So you suddenly have the merger of the two great technologies of the 19th century, photography and embalming. Both had actually been coexisting for a long time, which was, as soon as photography became possible, what happened? You had individuals requesting photographers take photos of the deceased. And photographers would advertise, we'll show up in under an hour or an hour to catch the most lifelike image possible. You had photos of children taken. This would be a photograph that would be the only photograph or photographic image that families would have of the deceased. And so it became something that more and more families did, especially as it became more and more affordable. But what embalming did was it took that visual template of the well-preserved, alive-looking dead body. It took that template and then it created a 3D preserved state, so that suddenly families and people could interact with the dead body over greater periods of time. It could be shipped home. And so embalming in itself becomes this real technological breakthrough that enables an enormous number of other kinds of technical possibilities. I'll just jump ahead. There's three images today, but I'll show this next one here. So this is an image from the 19th century, and I think it's important to understand that embalming as a technological intervention has largely remained the same today, in as much as it's an injection system. It was manual, it was mechanical in the 19th century, but now it has become automated. But that ultimately what we're looking at is a kind of technological control of the dead body in ways to sort of preserve it so that it becomes something different. It can become something new. It can become like a return of vigor, but also can become commodifiable. And this commodification process is something that is, of much debate still today. Nonetheless, there becomes a visual understanding that something can be done with the dead body technologically that just had not been done before. So I'll stop sharing that image now, and then I'll talk a bit more about some of the other images that way. But so the book starts in the 19th century, and then what it moves into from the 19th century is we work through this sort of nexus, if you will, of photography and embalming and the railway system in 19th century, really industrial technologies taking shape and hold around funerals. It then moves into the 1970s, which is a big jump. And I'm the first to say that. And there's something to be said about glossing over World War I and World War II. However, what I was interested in the 1970s was the emergence of different death social movements. And so in the 1970s, there's a real understanding that death and dying is suddenly now, and I was talking earlier, a kind of political movement. And so you have these, again, death acceptance movements, death with dignity movements. And there's a really important sociologist of death and dying, Lynn Laughlin, who's written expansively on a lot of different topics, but Laughlin put out a really crucial book in 1978 called The Craft of Dying, which MIT has helpfully republished in the 40th anniversary edition. It was long out of print, and I just felt it was such an important book to have back out there. I've written a new introduction for it, and colleague Ara Francis in the States has written a brilliant epilogue. Ara was one of Lynn Laughlin's last final PhD students, so it was very important that I think that Ara write that epilogue. It's a funny story how Ara and I actually ever got to talking about trying to publish Lynn's book, which I'll set that aside. However, in the 1970s, Lynn Laughlin identifies what she would call the happy death movement, and I think that it's a movement. It's a term that's not a pejorative, but she sees death in the 1970s in the West. This is an American phenomenon, but one that stretches into England, but then also Europe, that wants to embrace death and dying as being a positive experience, one that wants to engage the politics of, or the idea of hospice, which was a radical concept in its time, sort of by Cicely Saunders in England in the mid-60s. And that it's in the 70s that you begin to take shape. There's this whole idea of that death should become much more of something that everyone engages in. Now, what I would say is where the book heads after that. So in chapter 3, there's an important point in the 1980s where all the work that had been done in the 1970s, but also what had happened in the 19th into the early 20th century, it kind of comes to a standstill, or suddenly it's thrown up in the air. And then that's the AIDS epidemic. And so that, for me, chapter 3 of the book, which is about what I call the HIV/AIDS corpse, has actually lately been the chapter I've been reflecting on the most in this, if you will, period when we're talking about the COVID-19 and dead bodies. That, in the AIDS epidemic, you had the sudden creation of this new dead body, partly under both homophobic, but also just the worst kind of political conditions, cultural conditions, stigmas around homosexuality, but also intravenous drug users. And suddenly you have this dead body that just seemed completely infectious, out of control. It was regarded in some ways as dangerous. And so the AIDS corpse becomes this body that poses a huge challenge to what had been thought of as the technical supremacy of the 19th century embalming tools, where suddenly it seemed impossible to be able to do anything with this corpse because it was so infectious. Literally, it was thought of as almost radioactive because the format, the guidelines for handling something like this infectious dead body were oftentimes taken from victims of radiation, almost literally Cold War guidelines on what do we do with bodies exposed to gamma radiation. So we had funeral directors, wearing lead-lined gear in order to deal with people who died from AIDS. And I think that, what comes out of this whole AIDS, moment, which is still continuing. I think it's always important to remember that the AIDS epidemic and pandemic has not ceased. We're at 38 million dead. I mean, it's not gone away. But that it really transformed a politics of death and dying that picked up on the 1970s. And suddenly, what happens is there's this political exploration of what the dead body can produce. So one concrete example, I think, that comes out of HIV/AIDS and what happened in that moment was you can make an argument, although it took many decades, that something like marriage equality or same-sex marriage comes out of the AIDS moment, comes out of the HIV/AIDS experience with the dead body. Not only because if you were a same-sex couple, you had no legal rights over healthcare and healthcare decision-making in hospitals, but also because you had no legal rights with the funeral. You could literally be denied You could literally be denied access to the deceased. You could be denied access to your deceased loved one's remains, and that often happened, or kept from the funeral, or in fact kept from having anything to do with the funeral. And so I want to show you all very quickly an image of this from the National Funeral Directors Association, from the director, which will show you kind of what. Hang on a second here. Let's see if we can do this one more time. It'll show you in some ways what the images looked like. Here, try this one more time. Oh, it's not doing it. Hang on one second here. Wow, it's not sharing. Well, that's not sharing. We were doing so well without any technical breakdowns.
I know. Do you want me to screen share?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
And really, I just, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I think that this, the image itself, did you pull it up, Hannah, or is it showing?
Just 1 second.
Okay. What we'll be looking at here is, yeah, I don't know why that didn't, we have, thank you, Hannah. So what we have is in the director, which is the main publication of the National Funeral Directors Association in America. This is a 1987 image of the director. There we go. And it was the big cover issue around HIV/AIDS. And the reason I think this is an important image to look at, other than the very assertive, aggressive font, is that, you know, AIDS was literally understood. If you see it down at the bottom, you see the HIV virus literally understood as a kind of bomb going off. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the image of the virus looks at, you know, itself like a naval bomb, you know, a naval mine from you know, naval warfare. And in some ways, what I would say is, the reason I've been reflecting on what AIDS did is, you know, we saw all these changes happen to the American funeral industry. In part, you can think of something like an acronym we all know today, PPE, becomes a thing for the funeral industry. This idea of personal protective equipment is something that suddenly AIDS creates as a technical tool that needs to be done for the handling of all dead bodies under universal precautions. And so I think that when we think about what's happening today in relationship to COVID-19, it's important to understand that there are distinct relationships and practices that are established in the 1980s as a result of AIDS that we're not even aware of anymore. And that to me is actually really, I think, important to critically reflect on. Okay, Hannah, I'm all done with the image. Thank you very much for doing that. Apologies, everyone, for the sudden breakdown in my technical skills. I'm not sure exactly what happened with that, but you know, that's what happens. I will now move quickly through the book because I know we want to set aside time for Q&A, and I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions, maybe a few. So I think that through the rest of the book, moving on from AIDS, I think as we head into the latter part of the 20th, into the 21st century, there are a couple of very specific moments and things we need to think about. So some of the stuff I'm interested in and that the book explores, in chapter 4, we look at body worlds and Gunther von Hagens and what his reformulation of really 18th and 19th century spectacle did to the dead body. And I think what it says about this idea of human supremacy over death. In large part because my two impressions when I've gone to see body worlds displays, which are different than Bodies, the exhibition. Those are two different things. But the body worlds displays, I went to one of them in St. Paul, Minnesota, actually, at the Science Museum, and I remember thinking like, wow, I hope my dead body looks this good, you know, after I'm dead, which I think is one of those things. But also too, of course, I went to see body worlds with my dad, as you do. And I was like, yeah, Dad, what do you think? What do you think? And he was like, yeah, it's kind of like being at work. So I think that for me, body worlds was always this really interesting sort of moment of museum displays and what can go on that way. So I read about that. And then following on from that, I'm also interested in like, what is the repurposed life of the dead body? And so there's a whole economy, what I would describe as a necro economy of dead bodies that circulates around the uses of human tissues, bones, corneas, teeth, fingernails, a whole long list of biomaterials from the corpse that are used in both cosmetic purposes, but also for medical um, uh, procedures. And it's an economy that is largely, it's a gray economy. There is some regulation, but not the kind of regulation you might expect. And it's not regulated in the way that organs are regulated. And I want to be clear about that like organ donation is a different kind of sphere into itself, particularly in the United States, but really across Europe and the world, partly because I think that organs are afforded a more heroic status than things like, the femur of the leg. Which I understand and I support. But I'm interested in that transaction, that economy, that transactional work around the ideas of biomaterials, being bought and sold. The other thing I'm always interested in too is the politics of death and dying. And so I'm always interested in how we can understand how political leaders make changes to definitions of death. So the 6th chapter looks at this idea of there being a distinction between what we describe as a biopolitics or a politics of life, a thanatopolitics or a politics of death, and then a necropolitics or a politics of dead bodies. And for some of my academic colleagues, you'll recognize I'm sort of playing off of Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, and Achille Mbembe. Now, I actually I draw a distinction, I think, between Mbembe's work, this idea of necropolitics, because I think he's talking about a politics of death, which is a broader thanatopolitics, taken from the Greek of for thanatos, for death. But I think that there's a specific dead body politics that emerges across the 20th century. One concrete example of that is during the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and deaths in the Guantanamo detainee camp, which is still open. However, in the early days of the camp, you would have detainees dying, and the Bush administration literally trying to claim that there had been no death that took place. The living body had just gone from a living body to a dead body. And the reason there was no death was because if there was death, then there would be culpability or responsibility. And so that becomes this political act sort of at the state level. And you see this with the Trump administration, quite frankly, with deaths in detention camps in the southern border. It's the same kind of thing happening at different places. And so I'm always curious about the politics of death and dying, because I think that those play into then the final part of the book around sort of like, what is the future of death? Like, how do we understand what death might be? Part of this is built on what I would argue is sort of the transhumanist utopic vision for an ageless body, or a body that can live for centuries without the problems of aging. I've yet to see anything convincingly come out on those long-term possibilities. A lot of this begins in the 1970s around this, particularly cryopreservation systems, this idea of extending the dead body into a new life. But I think that I've really been reflecting on the sort of what I would say the transhumanist moment, which actually I think we're in. I think we've been in the transhumanist moment for a long time, where we've actually had an expanded lifespan. People are living much longer in the West now than they have been. And we've been reducing the effects of aging, which also is, by and large a good thing. I think my parents have absolutely benefited from that. However, it's become abundantly clear with the coronavirus as a novel virus that there are limits to our human technologies. There just are. Now there are many people working through the night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to figure out how to make attempts at new technologies around dealing with something like this specific novel virus. But I think it's also a reminder that there are limits to our human technologies when it comes to death. And that the sort of the end part of the book is also part thought experiment, because I'm curious, what are the possibilities of someone trying to patent death in the way that we've had life patented through different innovative, lab-based strategies. And then I end the book, as I begin the book, I mentioned the preface about my sister. I end the book reflecting on my sister's death. And I think that for me, part of the book is reflecting all these different kinds of strategies, starting from the technologies, 19th century, all the way through today. But I also think, part of the book, in large part for me, is just reflecting on our own personal relationship with death and dying, which can start to sound a bit almost theological, but it's not. What I mean is, how do we understand our own wishes, and how do we understand our own thoughts around, how do we understand the kind of death we would like or want for our own loved ones? And this actually was became a very important point for both my mom and myself. My father was in the hospital because he had filled out his advance directives in 2014, as had my mom. They did it at the same time, assigned me power of attorney for healthcare decisions. And so when my father was incapacitated and in the hospital, he suffered a anoxic brain injury from hypoxia as a result of the cardiac arrest. That paperwork, although it was paperwork, but still it was very helpful paperwork, really guided my mom and myself as we decided to make decisions around his care, because it was not clear at all what would happen with him. But it's also too, I think in the very end of the book, it's the coda. It's where I reflect on talking to my own sister more about her own death, and trying to understand how she understood both her funeral and what she would want with a funeral, but also to try and understand, how we use these tools. Because I just have to say on a very personal note, I feel so such empathy, and for the families right now who are having to communicate with loved ones who are dying in hospitals or care homes, nursing homes, on different media platforms, right? In part because the last time that my mom, dad, myself, and my sister all spoke, it was on Skype. And what happened is I was in Italy. I was there with my sister. This is actually at the time when I was talking to my sister about her own death, and she would die 2 weeks later. And I just said, Julie, let's talk to mom and dad. Do you want to talk on Skype? And she said, yeah. So we talked on Skype. We didn't know it at the time, but that would be the last time that the four of us would ever have a conversation together. So I feel now we had more choice in the matter and more control, but I feel for the families who have to do that, because I have a memory of what that's like, but also I know what it's like, to find out that a family member has died, through these same technologies. I was on my way to Italy to see my sister as she was in her hospice, and I knew she was dying, and our friend communicated that to me over the phone. So by the time I got to Italy, she was dead, and that was good, because I didn't want her to unnecessarily extend her life. So I think as I reflect on how these technologies have evolved over the centuries and how we humans use them, for me, in a strange way, as someone who studies this, I've realized how personal they become. And that is not something I set out to do when I wrote this book. And I think the more we can all critically reflect on how we use these everyday technologies. So here we are using Zoom for this talk. How everyday technologies like Zoom, a business meeting app, technology platform, can be used for something like a funeral. I think it's important to understand that there's a long history to how these technologies are used, and that we should expect to see them used more and more. But also too, to remember that they'll disappear and we'll forget they were ever used. And then that's part of the normal, if you would say, I think not progression, but human use of tools around death and dying. And I'll stop right there.
Great. Wow. Yeah, that's a really moving story. It's, there are a lot of ways to make light of the topic of death and dying. And I know that you do that a lot, but your personal experience really, brings it to a different place from the theoretical that you probably are more familiar with.
Yeah, I would agree. I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So thanks so much for speaking with us today, John. I think
my pleasure.
Very informative. And I also think understanding the history of all these things that we may be experiencing today, provide some context and,
Sure.
kind of rationalizes it all a little bit of why things are happening the way they're happening. Anyway, we do have time for some questions, and so I have included the questions in the directions on how to ask a question in the chat. Please do not ask questions in the chat. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, I believe, that you can submit questions into, and I will read them to John, and John will respond to them. So we already have a couple of questions, and I'll let the rest of you get your questions in. We have about 10, 15 minutes, so,
I'll answer them all. I don't care. Go ahead. I'll keep the answers short.
We'll see how many we can get done. So okay, let's start with, do you feel that today's current technologies are helpful in the process of dying and grieving?
Sure, they can be. I mean, yes, the answer would be yes, but I think I'm not. I think the helpfulness point is how we use them, right? So the technologies aren't doing anything. It's how I think it's how we humans use a tool. So I think they can be, absolutely. And I don't. I would never automatically say it's bad. So for example, you could take video teleconferencing technology, which I started writing about in 2010, and I had first heard about being used in funerals in 2007. So it's been around for a long time, but I think that it has been one of those things that is a natural extension of something like the telegraph line, if you will, which communicates the fact that someone has died. But also as an outgrowth of even, I would argue, camcorder technology. I mean, what's one of the first things that camcorders are used for? It's videotaping funerals, so people could watch them. So it can be helpful because that might be the only way that people are able to see the funeral of the deceased. This happened actually during the AIDS epidemic, where families would exclude people, but there might be a tape of the funeral, and so the people who'd been excluded could watch it still under this new technology. But then, of course, the technology's changed, right? Who has a VCR anymore? So I think that we should expect to see different things. So I think the answer is yes, it can be. It depends how we use them, right?
Yeah. Speaking of which, someone did ask, did your dad have experience with the quote unquote AIDS corpse, as you mentioned?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So my dad was a younger funeral director during the AIDS epidemic, or sort of the middle of his career, I would say. And absolutely he did. And we talked at length about that. In fact, in the way that these things happen in my family, one of the first, I remember having a conversation with him when I was a teenager, because he had prearranged a funeral that day for a gentleman who'd come in to see him who was dying of AIDS complications, and had prearranged his own funeral with my dad by himself. And I remember talking to my dad about the impact that it had on him, which was a current thing. So he did. He was part of a generation of funeral directors that were trying to be more open and accepting of what was going on, and trying to make space for same-sex partners and couples. He had many students over the years who were LGBTQ themselves, of which we forget there's a strong tradition of LGBTQ funeral directors. I think there's a really interesting history there. But he did, and I think that he's reflected on it when he's actually read the book. And he said, I totally forgot about these people who were just crazy about it. Like they were freaking out. And he said, I just didn't understand it at the time when it was happening.
Really?
Yeah.
Someone else asked if he was scared of working with those bodies.
No, I don't think so. No, no. The answer is no. We talked about that. No, and I think that he, and he taught embalming, like in mortuary science. He taught embalming. He taught cosmetics. I think honestly, he saw that work as part of what you did, like out of respect for the family. As out of respect for the next of kin, and so that was part of the job. But also trying to make funeral directing a more, I think, accepting of different kinds of kinship structures, like different kinds of families.
As I predicted, we do have a lot of questions about how funeral processes might be changing in the light of COVID-19.
Sure.
And you did say before that kind of the changes that happen because of AIDS are very much the same, processes that are still being used today. But someone asked, I guess a few people asked about kind of how embalming techniques might change, but then they also asked about how funerals might change.
Sure. Yeah, so COVID-19, and I want to be clear because I think the way I've sort of talked about it so far, I would open myself up for a fair point of critique, which is, the viruses are different and they are different and they're impacting society in different ways. And I want to be very respectful of the histories that are involved here. However, I will tell you that my frame of reference has been the AIDS epidemic since day one, with the social implications of what's been going on. I'm of a generation, I'm of a group that just can't, it would be difficult to escape, but I wouldn't want to. So how is something like embalming impacted? I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's going to be the actual embalming process. As it stands right now, based on the available research that is ongoing and needs to continue happening, I don't think embalming is going to change that much. Not really. The whole point of using PPE, as really pioneered and developed in response to AIDS, was to make embalming or handling a dead body from all causes of infectious disease safe. Let's put safe in quotes like that. So I actually don't think it's going to become, it won't change the embalming process that much. Now, what it might change, would be, does it happen as often? That's an open question. But I actually, based on what I've read so far in reputable, peer-reviewed research on anatomy and structures, I've not seen anything that suggests that the HIV or the COVID-19 corpse, and I think we can call it the COVID-19 corpse right now, maybe call it something different. I've not seen it as being an infectious agent in the way that it might be perceived. There's a flip on this, which is, so how are funerals changed? And that's the other side of the question, right? So how are funerals changed? Well, I think funerals are going to be the things that are changed, at least in the short term right now, as we've seen happen, potentially significantly, because it's not the COVID-19 corpse that is the infectious concern. It's the mourners, because you could have living mourners who are asymptomatic carriers of the virus and could themselves create clusters of viral infection without even knowing it. And we've had some instances of this now in the United States, where you had families that came together before the more aggressive lockdown procedures were in place in different states, and they vary. But nonetheless, they spread the disease amongst themselves as mourners, and family members died. So I think the funeral itself is going to change, which I think over the 20th century in particular, we became much more comfortable in the West, but around the world in a lot of ways, the funeral is becoming a much more intimate, close-knit experience. And I think that for the foreseeable future, it's going to be much more spread out. It's going to have to be a much longer duration of time. And I think that it's going to have to involve many different points of remembrance as opposed to one single funeral. So I think funerals will change, but I also think funerals have changed a lot. Like, funerals have changed. The funeral's never been static. It's always changed over the centuries. I mean, it's been one of those things that, has gone under lots of different alterations and changes. So those are a couple possible changes that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting to think about. And you mentioned before that religion is kind of an exception in funeral rites for some ways. Like, religion plays a large part in the center of funeral rites, and a lot of ancient traditions and traditions that have passed down for thousands of years are suddenly thrown off course because people are not able to be in the same space. Do you know, have any groups changed their funeral processes to adapt to the current situation?
Yes, and what I will say is this: all religious traditions, I've not seen one yet. All funeral traditions will adapt to the circumstances under which people are dying. So we've seen this in Islam, we've seen this in Judaism, we've seen it in Christianity across the Abrahamic faiths, but also then in other outside the Abrahamic traditions within Sikhs, Hindus, Jains, and we could go across the board. So yes, and the answer is yes. So for example, I've been reading accounts of a rabbi offering different prayers on Zoom, for family members, or in the Muslim tradition, which requires a washing of the body. And I apologize in advance to any of you who are watching who are yourselves Jewish or Muslim, and I'm completely terrible with some of the theological terms for these processes, so I apologize. I'm not doing it out of disrespect, but that there are these traditions that adapt. So in the case of the traditional washing of the deceased in both Judaism and Islam, I know that many of the individuals who do the washing, they have adapted and started using PPE, were available during the process, but still following the process. So I think that you'll find that all the religions will find ways to follow their practices under the new conditions. And I think in large part because if you talk to a rabbi, you talk to an imam, you talk to a minister, talk to a priest, all the different faiths, by and large, you'll kind of get a similar line, which is, God understands. God's okay with these things sometimes because it's just what we got to do. Or the different leaders of the faiths. And so you will find that will happen. Absolutely.
Do you think a lot of the changes that we're seeing, both with funeral rites, but also with end-of-life care, do you think that they could be kept normal if we had sufficient access to PPE?
Yeah, yes, I do. I mean, I think one of the things I found most frustrating in watching different government responses, and this is more of a critique of the UK response to end-of-life care or hospice care, or end-of-life care in hospitals or hospices, is that there was a sudden declaration by the UK government that everyone should have a right to see the deceased as they're dying, or should be able to be with them, which I completely agree with. However, the guidelines are already there for family members to be with someone as they're dying, and in the event that the person is in an immunosuppressive condition, you gown up as a family member to make it possible to see the person who's dying. So those protocol are in place already in hospitals and different hospices all over the place. That's not been the issue. The issue has been access to the appropriate equipment. And also there would be a time issue, making sure you had a member of staff who could make sure family members were properly, gowned in the equipment that was necessary. But I know the people I know who work in these areas would make that possible. So again, it was never an issue of families being restricted because there was somehow or other they weren't allowed in. It was always largely a result of there just wasn't the appropriate equipment or access to the equipment to do that. So going forward, if this is going to become more of a normal condition, and I'm not exactly sure it will, I think as more research goes into this virus, we'll find new approaches to what's going to go on. The same thing happened with HIV. Then I think that for the foreseeable future, the situation is going to be making sure that there's access to the PPE. And that will, and if families are given a choice between seeing the person who's dying and not seeing the person who's dying, based upon will you put on the PPE, they will put on the PPE.
Right.
They will put on the PPE. I have no doubt about that. And that to me, I've been filled with real rage at times. I'm only laughing about it because if I didn't, I'd be screaming at just like some of the government responses to these issues have just been infuriating.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially from your perspective of knowing what could be done and what's not being done.
Yes, that is a fair assessment, Hannah.
So there's just one more question about this particular topic, but I think it's an important one. So since we have such a large number of dead bodies at the moment, especially in New York, how do technologies of the corpse feed into the potential for managing the quote unquote COVID-19 corpse, including mass graves, overcrowding of hospitals, running out of space? I mean, New York doesn't have space for anything.
Yeah.
And beyond embalming practices?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that so from the start, I would say that all the major cities that have been impacted by COVID-19 today, um, so New York, London, but also Milan, different parts of Spain and Madrid. I actually think we need to reclassify what is going on in those cities as mass fatality events, and I think that we need, and this would come from the pandemic um, planning world, but they are mass fatality events, and because they are mass fatality events, uh, we need to then rethink how we're dealing with what is sometimes in the literature described as an excess of dead bodies, or an excess mortality rate, or a spike in mortality rates, which is just simply saying, as the question alludes to, a lot of dead bodies, like way more dead bodies than the system is used to. One of the terms I use to describe this is an infrastructure question. So there's always a national death infrastructure that is very local and very national. In this infrastructure, there are mechanisms in place to try to deal with the dead body and to manage it and to do it. So what's come out of COVID-19 is that these infrastructures have not been invested in properly, I think, by both national and local governments. Now, someone could say, should they have anticipated this? I actually think the answer is yes, because we've written numerous reports. Many colleagues have written reports over the decades saying that this is something to take seriously, but that wasn't done. Set that aside. What do we do going forward? Well, I think we need to reimagine in a city like New York, and particularly what is required and what is possible. So you're always going to have a requirement, and we could put requirement in quotes there, about what is the requirement, both, or the requirement, expectation, request of the family based on family choices, but also religious practice. What do they want? And to try and accommodate that, but keeping in mind, and this would be the second part, it's just going to take a lot more time. Now, in order to try and, I think, facilitate a lot of what's going on during this period of time, you're going to have to figure out, I think, new burial strategies, if that's going to be what is done. So New York actually has Hart Island, which for years has been used for the old term was pauper's graves, but that's not really the term that gets used anymore, and I think it's inappropriate anyway. But for years was used, and still is used, as a burial area for the unclaimed, unidentified dead bodies, or people who come from what we would describe in the UK as being public health funerals. But of course, families can then have the bodies exhumed and returned to them. I think someone will correct this very quickly, I'm sure, if it's wrong, but it's like a $250 charge to have the city exhume the remains, then return to the family for something future. So I think that going forward, if this is going to be a consistent situation, there may need to be a move towards a temporary burial situation. There is an example of this and how it's done effectively, and I think done well, and it's in Japan. So in 2011, when there was the massive tsunami that knocked through tidal waves, knocked all the crematoria offline in Japan, up in northern Japan, it became abundantly clear that there would be no cremation that was going to be done for a long time, and cremation is the dominant method of final disposition in Japan. 99.9% or 98%, 99% of people cremated. That wasn't possible. So what the Japanese government did is they temporarily buried everyone with ID on the wooden coffin, in a plastic bag, secure, in specifically marked graves, and told families that in the course of the next year, when it becomes possible, we will exhume the remains and we will have the proper cremation. So there are ways to do this, but it's going to mean coming up with, I think, creative strategies. So what could that mean? Well, it could mean new, larger methods of cremation, right? We could be talking about the idea of new kinds of cremation that might involve, a cremation facility that has far more cremation retorts than we've ever imagined, or new strategies for body disposal itself, whether it's new methods involving burial or alkaline hydrolysis, which is a water-based system, all of them. But I think there needs to be investment in how we think through how you can indeed deal with what will be a larger number of dead bodies than the current infrastructures used to deal with. And we should get used to this. I think we should get used to this as being something that will most certainly happen again and potentially keep happening for a while.
So we actually have a social anthropologist who studies Hart Island on this
Yes.
call. And they say that disinterments are common on
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, it is. And I want to give a big shout out to Melinda Hart, who had or not or Melinda what is Melinda's last name? It's Hart Island, but Melinda's. Oh, someone's going to correct that very quickly, I'm sure. In New York, and Melinda has absolutely been the person who has just really brought attention to Hart Island, and I think
Melinda Hunt.
Melinda Hunt, thank you, whoever said that. Sorry. Melinda, if you're on this call, I apologize. You're probably not. You're too busy. But Melinda, yeah, Melinda Hunt. I always do that. I was confused, Hunt and Hart. Anyway, Melinda has done an exceptionally good job over the years, and I've been writing about her work since like 2011 or something like that, in really bringing attention to Hart Island in New York, but also to like, this is not something to be ashamed of or hidden. I don't think it is. Like, I don't. There is no shame. I think there is no family should feel shame, or I think they shouldn't feel as if they're disrespecting the dead, because in an emergency situation, in a state of emergency, in which all the rules are thrown up in the air, you do the best you can. And I do worry that families will feel as if somehow they've disrespected their deceased loved one in this situation. And I just don't, I know that's not the case. That's just not the case. Don't be angry with yourselves, be angry with your leaders would be what I would say. But that comes from an older form of AIDS activism, perhaps.
So we are 10 minutes over, and I know you were eager to answer all the questions.
I'll take it. I don't care. Like, keep throwing it. I'm happy to answer the question.
Well,
I'm in Wisconsin. As long as I'm in Wisconsin, like, my parents' living room. So I got all kinds of time to answer these questions. As long as you got time.
Maybe a couple more, or at least
Okay.
a summary. A lot of them are about a couple subjects. But first of all, before we get into that, I do want to say there is a shout out from your first grade teacher, Carol Sauer. Is it Sauer or Sawyer?
Sauer.
She says, this is John's first grade teacher, Carol Sauer, asking what he himself plans to do with his body.
Yeah, Carol. So very quickly, Carol Sauer, first grade teacher. Hi, Carol. I'm so touched you're watching this. She, it's too bad I can't hear my parents. They're shouting in the back. At least hear me say that. Yeah. Carol. So my PhD dissertation was dedicated to Carol. I'm sorry. Yeah, she played a big role in my life. But so Carol, to answer your question, what do I want done with my body? That's a great question. I don't get asked that enough. I've made it very clear that I want my organs, bones, and tissues donated if possible. So I'm signed up to be an organ and tissue donor in both UK and America. Organ donation is not always possible. It depends on how you die. I would prefer that happen first, but I'm actually 100% totally okay with bone and tissue donation. Strip my body out as far as I'm concerned, use all the usable parts. I always hope that my biomaterials go to some child in a, burn unit, pediatric burn unit, or pediatric, some unit somewhere, but I also accept that that be the case. That's okay. I like to see my biomaterials used. And then as far as what happens to my remains, I'm fine with whatever goes on. I mean, whether it's cremation, or any of the alkaline hydrolysis processes, or I would prefer something smaller than that. But that's really what the key thing for me is biomaterial, organ and bone and tissue donation.
And you perfectly gave me the exact segue I needed into all the other questions, which are about the bioethics of, burial.
Right.
So
bioethics how? Like, what do you mean? Like?
So a lot of people have questions about environmentally friendly ways of burial.
Sure.
So do you have any recommendations of the most environmentally friendly ways to do this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's like, so if everyone's curious, there's a whole industry around eco burial or environmental burial. There's no question about that. And there was a funny comment about this on it was an article about green burial or green concepts of green burial many years ago, and someone wrote in who was I can't remember. They were Jewish, and they wrote in. They're like, "Always the Jews have been doing green burial for centuries." You know what I mean? Like the most simple kind of like burial of the kind of thing. And I think that within different faiths, but also then within different secular groups, we have this aspiration for what is the most environmentally friendly kind of burial that is possible. There's two ways to approach this, and I think that different people have different approaches, and boy, we could get into some heated arguments about it. I know, because I've seen people not argue, but have debates about this. So if you want a simple burial, actually I was asked about this one time, and I said, well, find an active volcano and then chuck your body into the active volcano. That's a pretty simple, straightforward way to do that. Getting access to the volcano might be the issue, and there would probably, depending on where the volcano is, there might be some different indigenous groups that don't like you doing that. So there's that. But as far as greener final disposition methods, I think in some cases you always need to think about, like, so what is the long-term use of what happens with your body? So sometimes a one-off disposal might be a technologically a more industrial looking process, but it might mean that fewer people are coming to visit your deceased body over the years, which would then also feed into an energy cycle. So is it greener to do sort of like natural burial or eco burial than say cremation? Well, the debate is, well, it may be, but cremation is a one-off event that, yes, uses a lot of gas and the resources, but then that's it. Whereas if you've got someone who's buried and the family keeps going back, then is that feeding into the life cycle itself, right, of the energy life cycle? So if you're looking for a short answer, what are the different methods that are being proposed? What I would say is this: people are exploring all different methods, whether it is more eco recycling, energy recycling uses of cremation, which you can do. You can recycle the heat energy to repurpose it. Whether it is water-based systems using alkaline hydrolysis, which would be a tissue digestion system. And there are different products and companies exploring that. One benefit would be recycling of wastewater, but also then the reusing of the water itself, possibly as a fertilizer. This then gets into weird soil and green terrain, which makes people uncomfortable, but nonetheless, it is quite likely. What about a more natural burial process where you sort of bury yourself into the ground, or different composting processes or different groups that way? All of this is possible. For me, I think one of the greenest ways to do it, I actually think that organ donation is one of the most eco-friendly things you can do. Now, there would be people who would say, no, that's not, because you're actually assisting other people to live. But my point is that if we're interested in recycling, then I think the recycling of organs is a really important biological, biomatter, however you want to think of, bioethical thing to do, if you can. But I would, I guess what I would say is read up on the literature, and if you've got a few years before this is going to happen, just keep up with what's going on with the advances in technology, because there are different advances. It just then becomes an issue of access. Can you access how you want to try and do it?
That's a really good point. I don't think I ever thought of being an organ donor as recycling. But
I will tell you right now, I think organ donation is one of the great success stories in human recycling, of human technologies of recycling, where you're transferring one piece of biomatter to another person. I think it's one of the great unsung success stories in that regard, and for all the right reasons. I think it's very good that way. Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you right now that the people who are asking about the burial stuff, they will be potentially deeply dissatisfied with that answer, because I think a lot of them are gunning for me to say one way is better than the other. I'll go back to my volcano answer. Straight into the active volcano.
Yeah, got to start planning for that now. Speaking of which, I know that we are way over, but you were gracious enough to.
As long as you got the time, I'm not. You know what I mean? Like, it's your schedule too. Like, I'm not.
Interesting. It's an interesting material, and I don't think we have the opportunity to talk about the subject very often.
Sure.
For natural reasons people don't want to talk about death all the time.
Oh, I think you're wrong. I think people love talk. No, I do. Honestly, I'll tell you right now. I've yet to even launch into my whole critique of the death taboo argument, which I completely reject.
Obviously.
No, and I'll tell you why. Because I think people love talking about death and dying, and I say this in part because I teach a sociology of death course, final year students, University of Bath. The Center for Death and Society director always teaches that class is always full. The students will routinely say, irregardless if he teaches it, like, I really love this class, I really got a lot out of it, and that I think that it's very important that I think people love to talk about death and dying, and I think that what we've fallen out of are opportunities to do that. Now we're in a moment when everyone is in many ways talking about death and dying, in part because of the coronavirus. And so I think what that has made entirely visible is that when we're given the opportunities to do it, we will. But that I think that's just one of those things.
So what would you recommend people do during a time like this, during a pandemic? I know a lot of people are afraid and are trying to avoid that fear, but how can we, tackle solutions for the possibility of death now?
Well, I'm sorry, 1 second here. My parents are. There are a couple things. One is, I think so. I'm gonna throw out a very practical thing, and this relates to my father, which is I think everyone needs to have health insurance if you can, by any means necessary, or talk to your family members about health insurance. Here's why I'm saying this. So I mentioned earlier in the talk that my dad was in the ICU in the hospital and then hospitalized for about 3 weeks, and then he was in transitional care. But let's just stick with the hospitalization. His total insurance, his total health, his total bill for his hospitalization, total bill was $420,525.25. So let me say that one more time. $420,525.25. And that was ICU care, ventilation, the whole thing we're talking about, but ICU care in particular, which is the most acute and the most expensive care. And I am deeply concerned that as we talk about people going into the hospital for hospitalization at all levels, but especially ICU care in America, that many of us Americans do not fully comprehend, even those of us with insurance, what that means in terms of cost. And I'm deeply concerned about what's going to happen to those costs, because in many cases, the next of kin will be hit with that bill even after the person has died. And they will be asked to pay, in many instances, families in the lowest socioeconomic and the worst kinds of socioeconomic situations, they will be hit with a bill that will not be payable. And I'm unclear what's going to happen. Now, my parents, because they're on Medicare, which is a nationally funded, paid for, single payer, if you will, healthcare program in America, because they're Medicare, they ended up only paying $1,300, just over $1,300 total for my dad's care. So that made that manageable for them, although for a lot of people that would be too much even, and I know that. But if what people are looking at in terms of medical treatments with COVID-19, I think one of the great as yet reported stories are going to be the horrendous medical costs that many people who are already grieving are going to have to then try and make sense of after the loved one has died. So that's that part. I really wanted to make a point of saying that, because I think that if any of you who are watching or listening are looking for what is one of the stories we're not telling enough about COVID-19, I absolutely think it's going to be the healthcare costs, both now that people are being billed and going forward, but especially people getting hit with these bills. What can people do now in addition to that? I think absolutely 100% you need to sit down and talk with your loved ones, especially older family members, but not just older family members, all family members, all ages. What are your end-of-life care wishes? It's better to get those things written down without being too shameless about it. There is a helpful list of questions to answer in the coda section of my own book. At the very end of the book, list of questions to answer. You can write your answers down. It's better to get it written down. If you want legal assurance then go talk with an estate planner or download the forms, get them signed and witnessed. It's better to have it in writing, but at a minimum, you want to have those conversations, and you want to have them now. So you're not trying to have them over the phone or over a video conference call with a hospital, or even worst case scenario, someone's incapacitated and you have no idea. You really want to try and think through, what kind of life support do I want? Am I willing to accept? And more to the point, what kind of quality of life am I looking for as a result of medical interventions like that? And I say this on a personal level because these were all the questions we went through with my dad's medical treatment. What kind of quality of life are we potentially creating for my dad as we begin to engage in these different levels of treatment? And in the end, they've worked out well for my dad. He's home. He's able to, to function on his own. He has minimal memory loss, some, but it's not no worse than you might expect. So it worked out, but that was not the guarantee. And I struggled with a lot of that, but it was helpful that we had all those decisions, that kind of guidance and paperwork. So after you get done here today, just talk to your family, like now, and make your own wishes clear. It's not just for mom and dad. Make your own wishes clear, right? Because I had to talk to my sister about that. Like, Julie, what do you want? Like, I never thought I was going to have that conversation, not at our age, but I did. So you never know when those things are going to happen.
Yeah. And I know that you've told me this a couple times already, and I've done it. So I think everyone else can.
Exactly. I mean, but do it. And I think, and we need, take seriously the healthcare costs situation. Cause I would be, someone might point out, and I'd be the first to say, my dad was receiving specialist cardiac care and actually neurology epilepsy care because he had some seizures as a result of the cardiac arrest. I take that on board. So maybe his bill is higher than a person who's in an ICU for COVID-19. I don't know. Take $200,000 off the bill automatically. Fine. That's still $200,000, right? And who's going to pay for that, right? And that's what I'm anxious in addition to just, really concerned about where all these costs go for families who are struggling with the death of a loved one, or just simply trying to figure out what kind of quality of life that person will have once they're out of the hospital.
Yeah, and that's something we certainly all have to think about. But thank you so much for sharing your insight today, John. We are almost at 2:00, so we have gone as far as I will let a talk like this.
That's fine. Don't worry about it. I wanted to say, I think if all goes according to plan, I'm doing a video, so on-screen video AMA, Ask Me Anything question Q&A on Reddit, which is, we're already in dangerous territory, but that's okay. So video Q&A on Reddit on May 25th. So write that down, May 25th on Reddit in the afternoon. I think that's still to be confirmed, the details through MIT. But if you go to my Twitter account, I'll just plug all the plugging here. I'll just plug all the forums to get hold of me. But if you go to my Twitter account, which is @DeathRef, so DEATHREF, which is the Death Reference Desk, which I started with my good friends Meg and Kim, who are two librarians. But if you go to the Death Reference Desk Twitter account @DeathRef, or follow the Center for Death and Society too. The Center for Death and Society has absolutely has social media presence, and that's @SendDeathSociety. Or my other project, the Future Cemetery, which I haven't really talked a lot about, but that's @Future Cemetery. So I'm all over the place. But if you just look at the Death Reference Desk, I'll make sure those details are put up, and absolutely happily answering the questions that people didn't get to today, or post them on Twitter. We'll see what we can do with those. I'm happy to do that as well, because there's a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah, a lot of interest in this topic. And we do have a video of this talk coming out next week. Great. And then we have another talk next Tuesday. And I feel like we're just exploring so much because our next talk is on extraterrestrials.
Yes. So there's a strong tradition between the near-death experiences of the 1970s and the extraterrestrial surge in extraterrestrial work, and that's a whole other area I could go into. But no, absolutely. Or the history of the alien corpse. That's an area I've always wanted to write into.
Wow,
Like,
let's see if we can add that in.
yeah, like the ancient alien corpse and all that. That's a whole strand of where death studies begins to merge with lots of different areas. But yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, John. I feel like
No, thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone at MIT, and really thank you all the people. I hope we were able to get to enough of your questions, but thank you to everyone who tuned in. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone's interest, in the book. And I've been really moved by the responses that I've gotten to the book, but my parents have too. Like, I think we've, as a family, we've really been touched by how things people have said to us as a result of that. So, and that's good. I think that's good. I like that. So.
And if you do want to find the book, you can go to our website. I've sent the link in the chat. And if you always want to Google it, Technologies of the Human Corpse, MIT Press.
I also created my own website too. You want to go look at it, you just do johntroyer.com. But we'll just try and do all the plugging right now. But yeah,
all the plugs.
It's all over the place.
We also have a blog post that I've linked to that will share all the different places you can buy our books right now. I know that some people are concerned about shipping delays, and so we have ebooks, we have ways to order through independent businesses on there. So take a look.
All the places you can get it from, all the places. It doesn't have to be just one.
You're right. You have 5 copies, like John.
Well, yeah, that was sent from the yeah. So anyway.
Thank you all. I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.